A special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters. You can find out how you can support our show by visiting patreon.com/thecyberwire. A new campaign targets humanitarian organizations with North Korean phishbait. Memcrash is now being exploited by criminal extortionists. It's time for spring break, but not the fun kind. Equifax losses from last year's breach are said to mount. Germany says it detected the compromise of a secure government network before too much damage was done. They don't offer official attribution, but everyone else says it was the Russians. The Russians say they didn't do it. And President Putin deplores yelling and hollering in the U.S. Congress. Now a moment to tell you about our sponsor, Observit. It's 2018. Traditional data loss prevention tools aren't cutting it anymore. They're too difficult to deploy, too time-consuming to maintain, and too heavy on the endpoint. They are high maintenance and require endless fine-tuning. It's time to take a more modern approach. With Observit, you can detect insider threats, investigate incidents quickly, and prevent data loss. With its lightweight agent and out-of-the-box insider threat library, Observit is quick to deploy and far more effective at stopping data from leaving your organization. That's because Observit focuses on user behavior. It's built to detect and respond to insider threats, and it's extremely difficult even for the most technical users to bypass. Bring your data loss prevention strategy into the modern era with Observit. Learn more at observit.com/cyberwire. That's observit.com/cyberwire. And we thank Observit for sponsoring our show. Major funding for the Cyberwire podcast is provided by Cylance. I'm Dave Bittner with your Cyberwire summary for Monday, March 5th, 2018. McAfee researchers report finding a new campaign that targets international humanitarian aid organizations. The actor behind the operation is not specified, although McAfee believes it to be a Korean speaker. The malicious documents are baited with news about North Korean relief organizations. McAfee ties one persona, Snoopy Killer at mail.ru, to the operation. Memcrash distributed denial of service attacks have apparently been criminalized. DDoS attackers seek to extort cryptocurrency from victims. Akamai, who followed the DDoS campaigns closely and played a principal role in GitHub's swift recovery from what's being called the largest DDoS attack on record, has spotted extortion notes buried in the attack traffic. The hoods are asking for Monero, which appears attractive to them because of its greater relative anonymity than competing cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin. Researchers at LGTM have discovered a vulnerability in the widely used Pivotal Spring web development framework. The issue, which they're calling Spring Break, is said to be an easily exploitable arbitrary command execution bug. The vulnerability is similar to problems with Apache struts that, going unpatched, were exploited in the Equifax breach of 2017. And speaking of Equifax, its breach may prove to become the most expensive hack yet recorded. CRN reports that the company's breach-related costs, as disclosed in a Friday earnings conference call, could rise to $435 million by the end of 2018. This estimate comes on top of last week's news that almost 2.5 million more consumers than previously known had been affected by the breach. More affected individuals may come to light as the long process of investigation continues. Germany's Interior Ministry says that relatively early detection of intrusion into a sensitive network averted what could have been considerably more extensive damage than the government sustained. The spokesman declined to offer attribution, but unofficial consensus is that the hack was a Russian operation. Russia's foreign ministry denies any involvement and cites the incident as another case of Western governments reflexively and in bad faith blaming Moscow for anything that goes wrong in cyberspace. Russia's President Putin offered a similar response to U.S. concerns about election hacking. He wants to see the evidence. It's a lot of, quote, yelling and hollering in the United States Congress, says Mr. Putin. To be sure, there is a lot of yelling and hollering on Capitol Hill, but there's more to Russian election interference than that. Anyway, he'd like to see the accusations forwarded to Russian authorities through official channels, because of course he's solidly committed to the rule of law, or something. Mr. Putin said in an interview on NBC Friday, "With all due respect for Congress, you must have people with legal degrees." Investigation of Russian influence operations, which aren't seriously in doubt, have become, observers lament, increasingly partisan, with yelling and hollering across the aisle. Meanwhile, leaked documents are thought to provide some insight into the operations of Russian troll farms and their objectives. Those objectives appear, as always, to include the overarching goal of fomenting mistrust. Some think they see more specific economic objectives as well. The U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Science, Space, and Technology released a majority report last Thursday in which they allege that Russian social media exploitation was engaged in attempts to suppress U.S. fossil fuel production. The report itself notes that the Russians are, quote, intent on exploiting existing divisions and social movements in the United States, end quote. That seems right. The social media engagement on energy development does seem in some respects difficult to distinguish from the general goal of creating chaos, but there appears to have been some interest on the trolls' part in inhibiting natural gas pipeline development. Still, in this case, it's difficult to separate signal from noise. The troll farm was certainly busy on the social media front, and it remains unclear just how many followers they attracted. Last fall, Facebook told California Democrat Senator Feinstein that, quote, approximately 1.8 million people followed at least one Facebook page associated with the Internet Research Agency, end quote, that is, the big St. Petersburg troll farm. But Wired reports that a researcher at Columbia University's Tow Center for Digital Journalism, Jonathan Albright, thinks that in fact Facebook has considerably underestimated those numbers, and that it really has no idea how many humans followed the trolls, because it never really looked into the trolls' Instagram accounts. Albright has, and he estimates that the answer is in the millions. And what about those trolls, the ones from the Internet Research Agency who were indicted as a result of Special Counsel Robert Mueller's investigation? They're an interesting mixed bag, according to an account in Fifth Domain. They're described as 9-to-5ers, interested in building their careers and not terribly concerned about the nature of their work. A former employee of the Internet Research Agency, one who wasn't indicted, told the AP that her colleagues, quote, came to the factory and thanks to their personal qualities and knowledge of English, they were rapidly promoted, end quote. Among them were a student of psychology with an interest in loneliness, a journalist who did stand-up comedy on the side, and a wildlife management graduate from a little town near Irkutsk who apparently thought of himself as a Siberian Jay-Z. What are they teaching them at the Russian State Hydrometeorological University these days, anyway? Now a word about our sponsor, the Johns Hopkins University Information Security Institute, providing the technical foundations and knowledge needed to meet our nation's growing demand for highly skilled professionals in the fields of information security, assurance, and privacy. We value their expertise and insights as one of the CyberWire's academic partners, and of course, they're one of the world's great research universities. The Institute is also an NSA and DHS designated Center of Academic Excellence in Information Assurance in Cyber Defense and Research. Visit isi.jhu.edu to learn more, and there are scholarships available. That's isi.jhu.edu. And we thank the Johns Hopkins University Information Security Institute for sponsoring our show. And joining me once again is Ben Yelin. He's a senior law and policy analyst at the University of Maryland Center for Health and Homeland Security. Ben, welcome back. We saw a recent blog posting from Bruce Schneier about the Section 702 reauthorization. This blog post is called After Section 702 Reauthorization. It was reauthorized. Can you take us through some of the points that Bruce is making here and your thoughts as well?
Sure. So he is sort of saying that this represents a bit of a loss for civil libertarians as it relates to electronic surveillance for national security purposes. The FISA Amendments Act was originally enacted in 2008 with the support of then Senator Obama. We later found out through the Snowden disclosures in 2013 that it was being used to justify warrantless collection, both through our internet service providers in a program called PRISM and from our internet infrastructure, our internet backbone, through what we call upstream collection. And one of the reasons it became so controversial is that even though the program is intended to collect the communications of non-U.S. persons who are located abroad, sometimes the communications of U.S. persons or even wholly between U.S. persons can get enraptured as part of this collection. There's no judicial authorization required for this collection, and the information, the communications, goes into a giant government database that is available to almost all of our intelligence agencies, meaning it's searchable. So if I were to talk to a potential terrorist target overseas, even if that conversation was something that I wanted to keep private, the government could collect that without any sort of judicial authorization, without a warrant. It would be searchable, and if they found evidence of a crime in searching for that information, they could use it to prosecute me. After the Snowden disclosures, and I think this blog post sort of gets at this point, there was a thought that we might be at this new moment where there's political will to curb these excesses of electronic surveillance and have a moment where we restore our civil liberties. The program was set to expire at the end of 2017. It was extended for a couple of weeks into January, and in January they passed a reauthorization bill that only made very, very minor changes to the law. One of the changes is that you now do need a warrant to search the database of collected communications if you are only doing so for the purposes of a criminal prosecution. Obviously, that's a giant loophole. Some of these intelligence agencies could certainly assert that they're only searching these databases for foreign intelligence information. And if they just happen to come across evidence of a crime, there's nothing stopping them from prosecuting. So it wasn't sort of the robust civil liberties protection that those in favor of reforming Section 702 really desired, which is to have all searches of 702 data be subject to a warrant requirement. So another thing that this blog post sort of gets at is, what do we do now? And I think that's a very important question. We've sort of tried the judicial route. Some of the foremost protectors of civil liberties in our country, the ACLU and the Electronic Frontier Foundation, have been filing lawsuits against this program for years, and they've never been able really to get a case heard on the merits because, as we've talked about before, it's very difficult to establish standing. It's very difficult for a person to establish that he or she has been subject to that government surveillance because the information is classified. And, now this program has been reauthorized for 6 years. Our political conscience has sort of moved on. And, I can understand why this blogger feels a little hopeless. Frankly, I think it was a big setback for those who wanted wide-ranging and sweeping reforms to the surveillance program.
And from a law enforcement side, they make the case, I suppose, that requiring oversight from judicial oversight slows them down and impedes their ability to do their work in a timely manner.
Absolutely. And they have some backing in our Fourth Amendment jurisprudence. There's been this long-running doctrine that if law enforcement or intelligence agencies have some sort of special need, apart from normal law enforcement needs of, nabbing the criminals and putting them behind bars, then generally they do not need a warrant to conduct that surveillance as long as the search is reasonable. And how we've come to define reasonableness is balancing the security interests involved, so the government's interest in collecting that information, against the potential invasion of privacy. And, trying to look at that objectively, we know that Section 702, at least according to some of our top intelligence professionals, has proven to be quite effective in thwarting terrorist attacks and identifying targets. But, you balance that against what I think is a major inhibition on privacy and civil liberties. The fact that there's this so-called backdoor search. The government could incidentally collect the communication of a U.S. person without any prior judicial authorization. And if there's some sort of evidence of a crime contained in that information, they can make an arrest on what would otherwise be an unconstitutional illegal search. So we balance those security interests against those privacy interests. I think there are arguments to be made on both sides, but it's something that I think I would like to see either really adjudicated in a federal court or sort of played out in the public sphere. And I think this blogger and a lot of others thought we were really going to get that debate in Congress when Section 702 was up for reauthorization at the end of 2017. But there was such a logjam of legislation that needed to get passed that I don't think Section 702 really got the time for the sort of protracted, wide-ranging debate about electronic surveillance that I think many of us wanted to see on the House and Senate floor.
Ben Yelin, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
And that's the Cyberwire. Thanks to all of our sponsors for making the Cyberwire possible, especially to our sustaining sponsor, Cylance. To find out how Cylance can help protect you through the use of artificial intelligence, visit Cylance.com. And thanks to our supporting sponsor, E8 Security. Follow the behavior, find the threat. Visit e8security.com to learn more. The Cyberwire podcast is proudly produced in Maryland out of the startup studios of Data Tribe, where they're co-building the next generation of cybersecurity teams and technology. Our show is produced by Pratt Street Media with editor John Petrick, social media editor Jennifer Iben, technical editor Chris Russell, executive editor Peter Kilpie, and I'm Dave Bittner. Thanks for listening.